You're listening to Collected, stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of Australia, Mr. J.B. Chifley.
Fellow citizens, the war is over. The Japanese government has accepted the terms of surrender imposed by the Allied nations, and hostilities will now cease.
The Japanese surrender on the 15th of August 1945 sparked an outpouring of joy and celebration across Australia.
The years of blood and tears had ended in resounding victory. Australia joined her allies in an outburst of rejoicing, the like of which her cities had never seen before. The pent-up emotion of 6 years poured out as a flood. Freedom was really theirs.
Amongst the tens of thousands of people on the streets of Melbourne was a young woman wearing a vest made especially for that day.
She's photographed here wearing the vest with her colleagues from the Kodak factory. We know who she is now. It took 50 years to discover her identity. It's Lois Ann Martin, and she knitted the vest for VP Day in anticipation of the end of the war with Japan.
Eleni Holloway is an assistant curator at the memorial. She's showing me the vest on display with Lois's photo in the World War II gallery. The woolen vest is hand-knitted in a simple rib stitch in wide horizontal stripes.
You can see there are 3 horizontal bands of colour on the front panel, starting with the red and then the white in the middle and the royal blue at the bottom. On the back, Lois has knitted it in a pale blue wool, and she stitched the front and the back piece with some scrap leftover red wool yarn. There are 2 buttons on the top left shoulder, a red and a blue button.
There's no doubt what this vest was made for. Lois also knitted white letters spelling out VP Day that are sewn across the top red stripe.
What this tells me is that it was really more of a last-minute creation of hers in the lead-up to the surrender of Japan. By mid-1945, a lot of people had anticipated the end of the war, but they didn't really know when it would take place. You can see that this was made very quickly by her as she had sort of prepared for that day. And so she's probably just used whatever she had available around, her house, and whatever leftover wool that she had. I'm sure she was knitting socks for the soldiers as well. So something like that could really be made fairly quickly by an experienced knitter, I would say in a matter of days. So, yeah, it's really interesting. It's a really stunning piece, and it's amazing because she knitted it for VP Day. Lois wore it on VP Day and then she never wore it again. She actually packed it away and never wore it again. So it's in absolutely stunning condition, and we are really lucky to have something in this condition in our collection. Yeah, given that textiles tended not to survive as well as other more robust materials.
And doesn't she look fabulous in the photo that was snapped of her, a newspaper photo of the day? She's got this thick, curly hair and her head's tilted up and she's grinning with her 2 girlfriends on either side.
Yeah, that's just a stunning image. Just the joy, the absolute joy and excitement on their faces is just wonderful. She's wearing the vest. She's got VP written on her forehead and on her cheeks in lipstick as well. She's really gone all out for the day. Now, that photograph was actually taken by our Melbourne Herald-Sun photographer. It was printed on the front cover of a special VP Day edition on the 15th of August, and she was just referred to as a VP girl enjoying herself. It was sort of under a little section on VP fashions. So we didn't really know who she was, but fast forward 50 years, the Australian War Memorial was opening a new showcase exhibition on VP Day, and the memorial and the Herald-Sun set out to identify the young woman wearing the vest.
The VP Day newspaper photo of Lois and her friends was published again in 1995 in the Melbourne Herald-Sun under the headline "Search for Victory Girls." The response was quick. A man called Bill Drew recognised the VP girl as his late wife, Lois.
Unfortunately, she had passed away 13 years prior, but he produced the vest to back his story, and we have this vest in the collection now thanks to Bill.
So she kept it all her life, and after she died, her husband kept looking after it.
That's right. So, she packed it away, and then her husband Bill and their 2 sons kept it in memory of Lois, which is, again, very incredible. That it was such a special item to her that they would continue to hold on to it.
Did Lois know Bill during the war? Was he away, or did Lois have a sweetheart who was in the war?
Look, unfortunately, we don't really know too much about Lois's wartime experience, apart from the fact that she was just a regular girl working in the Kodak factory in Abbotsford in Victoria. Unfortunately, an oral history wasn't collected at the time when the handover took place. So when Bill contacted the War Memorial and decided to donate the vest, there was a really big handover ceremony, and Bill was unfortunately too sick to attend, so Lois and Bill's son Stephen brought the vest up to the War Memorial, and it was handed over. The curators here and the staff were extremely excited and over the moon to have this item in the collection. And I can really say that it is a national icon now. I think when you think of VP Day and you think of the memorial, and if you have been here, you think of the vest.
This day of victory meant loved ones would now be safe. Families once again reunited to enjoy the things for which their men and women had fought. So let's go mad for one unforgettable day.
You're listening to Collected, stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. So what were the events leading up to the Japanese surrender?
So if we cast our minds back 75 years, the fighting in the Pacific War has been continuing from the Australian point of view since December 1941. We're in the 6th year of the Second World War. Germany had surrendered in May of 1945, so the end was in sight. However, a lot of people thought or assumed that the war against Japan would continue at least until 1946.
Dr. Carl James is the memorial's head of military history.
The Japanese had suffered a series of military and naval defeats across the Pacific. The Japanese were also being surrounded by the Allied submarine campaign. During the course of 1945, they were being subjected to bombing from American B-29 bombers. So the Japanese were really getting pounded day and night. Series of battlefield defeats. On the 6th of August, the Americans dropped a bomb on Hiroshima.
The atomic bomb?
The atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And then on the 9th of August, the Americans dropped the follow-up bomb on Nagasaki. The Soviet Union have invaded Manchuria, so they've joined the Pacific War. And so in many ways, the Japanese have really been surrounded, they're being strangled. It's a very intense period. And then around about the 11th of August, we start to see press reports that the Japanese are considering surrendering. So they wanted to accept the terms of surrender. And so that's on the 11th of August. People start to take a breath, maybe the end's in sight. And then on the 15th, the Japanese emperor announces that Japan will accept the terms of surrender and essentially the war ends.
How did Australians know officially that the war had ended? How was it announced?
Well, old school press. So basically it was radio. They listened to the broadcast of Prime Minister Ben Chifley's announcing to his fellow Australians that the war is over, that Japan had accepted the terms of surrender, that fighting would cease.
At this moment, let us offer thanks to God. Let us remember those whose lives were given, that we may enjoy this glorious moment, and may look forward to a peace which they have won for us.
And this led to an outbreak of celebrations, relief, and almost hysteria in many areas, particularly within mainland Australia. So you had radio broadcasts, you also had press reports, and people were really, on the morning of the 15th of August, they were expecting the news, and it kind of broke in Australia around about 11:30 a.m, and people just went crazy. And then there were parties and celebrations from the afternoon of the 15th of August onwards across the country.
There were also parades hastily organised. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the day is marked in many different ways in different areas. So we've seen photographs and newsreel footage of the dancing men in Sydney, for example. So there was ticker tape parades in the city of Sydney. It's estimated that 1 million people crammed into the city for basically a street party. There was a big march of 50,000 veterans, servicemen and servicewomen and auxiliaries marched through the streets of Sydney. Took place around about Martin Place and paraded through the city. And then in the afternoon, there was a Thanksgiving Day service, or a Thanksgiving service that took place at the Domain. And that was just in Sydney, and you had similar things in Brisbane, Melbourne, Perth, Adelaide. It's really interesting. If you look at newspapers and contemporary photographs, the streets are just packed with people. And it's today's social distancing. It's really odd to see thousands of people smashed up together, just celebrating, dancing, singing. And there's this massive sense of relief. Now, there is an element of just pausing, grief, and you have this strange juxtapositioning, even on the 15th, of party and celebrations, marches that are celebratory. This was a clear victory over Japan and the end of the Second World War. But tinged with that too, there is grief, the solemnity. You do have these Thanksgiving services, and you have that quiet reflections of people at home thinking, yep, great, the war is over. We can take a breath. But what about my husband, my father, my brother, my sister, who aren't going to come home? So how did those people feel? So it is really a day of mixed emotions.
The grief of those Australians who'd lost their loved ones was acknowledged in Ben Chifley's address to the nation.
Let us remember those whose thoughts, with proud sorrow, turn towards gallant loved ones who will not come back.
The service will begin in approximately 5 minutes' time.
On the following day, August the 16th, a solemn Thanksgiving service was held at the War Memorial.
Let us remember those who have given their lives in battle. O Lord, thou lover of souls, who through the mouth of thy prophet of old hast declared that all souls are thine, we thank thee for the brave and faithful dead who have willingly laid down their lives in the cause of freedom, of faith, and of righteousness. Into thy keeping we commend their souls, praying that we, inspired by their example, may give our lives in service and sacrifice with a like courage and devotion. We'll now sing the hymn, Now Thank We All Our God.
But what about those Australians still on the front line or prisoners of war? How did they find out the war was finally over? Dr. Carl James.
That's a great question, because from your frontline soldier or your prisoner of war in Changi or Renau or various other places across the Japanese Empire, it's a really weird day. From the soldier point of view, from about, again, the 11th of August, they were receiving orders saying, hey, the Japan looks as though they're about to surrender. They're on the edge. So aggressive patrols were pulled back. People were told you can defend yourself if attacked by the Japanese, but just hold tight. Soldiers tended to become very, very risk averse, which makes perfect sense. They've just got through this war. The end's in sight. You don't want to get knocked right at the very end. And so they have this sense of, and you see it in the frontline units and frontline soldiers, that, wow, it's almost like a sense of disbelief. It's like, this thing is over. But the Japanese are still here. They're on the next side of the river. They're on the other hill. We've received the reports and orders that the war is over, that Japan have surrendered. Do the Japanese know? So the first thing that happened in lots of areas, particularly, say, New Guinea and Bougainville, was you had the Air Force flying over Japanese-controlled territory, dropping leaflets, dropping surrender pamphlets saying, hey, the Emperor has surrendered, stop shooting, the war is over. Likewise, Japanese headquarters relayed through its chain of command through Japanese orders and bases saying the fighting has stopped, lay down your weapons, the war is over. The news was conveyed through orders, through press reports, and then, just releasing pamphlets from aircraft. So that was amongst the frontline soldiers themselves.
Alexander Lockhead was a lieutenant in the 39th Australian Infantry Battalion. He'd spent years fighting the Japanese in New Guinea.
I lost 2 killed and 1 wounded on 2 days before the end of the war.
Did you know the war was near end?
No, we had no idea at all. The only indication was on the the day the war finished, I think it was, that morning we heard the drums up and down the Sepik, and we were just over the ridge from it. And the natives, carriers, said, war she finished, master. We said, ha ha ha, and they said, yes, that's right. And anyhow, just then they said, patrols are finished, go back to your area and keep a good lookout because the Japanese might do something stupid. And later in the day we heard the war had finished.
How did you feel?
Well, at that stage relieved, but then again we were still forward and we didn't know what was going to happen because we knew a lot of Japanese were caught between us and the 17th Brigade, and we weren't quite sure of what reaction they'd do. So for the next fortnight, whilst we sat there, it was quite a tense period.
Well, was there in fact any shooting?
No. Everyone acted. We could see them moving around outside our perimeter, and there was no contact made.
They didn't shoot at you?
They didn't shoot at us. We didn't shoot at them. But then we still had no official word of what was happening. We didn't, because I don't think our people knew what reaction initially they would happen, whether it be any banzais or death attacks or what have you. And in the next, after about a fortnight, we pulled out there and reassembled back on at Wewak.
Elizabeth Lucas was a major in the Australian Women's Army Service, stationed in Darwin. Decades later, she too reminisced about the end of the war.
I know I was in an officer's mess, and they just opened the mess. There was alcohol there. Everyone was dancing on the tables. Tremendous.
Did you dance on the table?
Oh, yes. Yes, it was great excitement. Mm.
Within the prisoners of war, though, that was quite different. So, and it really depended where they were, whether the prisoners were in Changi or in Japan. In memoirs and in hindsight, a lot of Australian POWs felt and reflected that mid-August, the Japanese started, their interactions toward the prisoners started to change. All of a sudden they were friendly, sometimes less brutal or less violent. And it's only really in that second part of August, so after the 15th, that the Japanese start to tell the prisoners that the war is over. So you have a sense of relief from the former prisoners of war, disbelief, and all of a sudden they just want to get home.
Adrian Kerr-Lewis was a Captain General Staff Officer and a prisoner of the Japanese in Changi. He recorded this oral history in 1984.
The rumours had gone round that the war was over. We didn't know what the Japanese attitude would be, whether they would slaughter us all, and there was a very great fear that they'd go mad and kill us all. And we didn't think after 3.5 years that it would be very popular. So the boys went out to work. They were going out to work and working on the Changi aerodrome. They went out in the ordinary way. They didn't for one moment show any signs of knowing anything about it. And until the Japanese flag came down on the jail and the Union Jack went up.
How did the men behave then? Do you take it quietly or uproariously? How do men respond?
Not uproariously, no. The Gurkhas were the only ones who showed any sign of resentment by ordering the Japs. They measured out 100 yards on the padang, like the cricket ground, measured out 100 yards and gave them 3 or 4 turfs to carry in their arms, with their hands in front of them, and to run the 100 yards in a fixed time. I've forgotten how long it was. Well, no one can run 100 yards in 10 seconds like that, but they would just get a bayonet and tap him very lightly in the stern and make him run a bit faster. And the Chinese loved to see the Japanese in trouble. But that's the only retaliation that I saw or heard of in the whole show when it finished.
So this big pressure and the very big expectation was on the fast recovery of our prisoners of war from all across Japan, because it wasn't just saying Changi or in Japan itself, but you had Australian prisoners in Thailand, Malaya, Indochina, say modern-day Vietnam. They're all scattered across the Japanese Empire. And it took several weeks, it's really not until about mid-August, that many Australian families back home learnt the fate of their loved ones. Because keep in mind, for those prisoners who were captured in Singapore, say the 15th of February 1942, a lot of those, and the soldiers of the 8th Division, as well as from Rabaul, when they're captured by the Japanese, they disappear off the face of the earth. So your families back home in Australia, they don't know what happens to them because the Japanese weren't doing the Red Cross communications. You didn't get updates from the prisoners. So it's that gap of 3.5 years of not knowing, and it's only in September. So after the Japanese are surrendered, the Japanese are starting to process what you can do, and investigators are able to go to Changi and elsewhere. Then they do that work thinking, okay, well, what happened to these people? Are they alive? Are they dead? And so you have relief sometimes saying, okay, this is, my brother, my son, my husband survived. Or, in cases, no, I'm sorry, he died. He died in 1942 or 1943 in the Thai Burma Railway. Or in the case of Sandakan, it's like, well, they made it until 1945, and then they either died on the death marches or they were executed at Ranau or Sandakan itself. So VP Day is really complicated because it's partly celebratory, it's partly a relief, an acknowledgement that after 6 years, this incredible burden, this horrific event is finally over. And it's also that, well, the war's over, but we're going to miss our loved ones. So it's a really complicated day. It's not just about singing and dancing in the street. There's this tinge of sadness, commemoration, and reflection.
There were also challenges ahead for ex-soldiers and the families of those who'd served as they adjusted to life in peacetime. But despite the shadows, the mood on that VP Day in 1945 was overwhelmingly one of jubilation, summed up in a bright woolen vest worn by a young woman brimming with life. Assistant Curator Eleni Holloway.
I think it really encapsulates Australia on that day, just the absolute joy and celebration that took place on VP Day. You can see all of the footage here and the images. People were just over the moon, overjoyed. Pubs and bars, stayed open all day and people just continued to celebrate. The war was over.
Tear up some paper, it's the thing to do. Telephone books, old posters, income tax forms, torn up and tossed around. They're ripping the peace to pieces.
Carl, what do you think of Lois Martin's vest?
I think it's incredible. I think it's for a whole range of different reasons. One, it shows just at a grassroots level, at an individual person, the effort she put into, first of all, knitting the vest, the fact that she knew this was probably coming, because it's not something you can smash out overnight, but also the red, white and blue, it has the colours of, Australia, of the British Empire. It's celebratory. It is that sense of a relief that we've come through this ordeal. It's a great moment. It's a great object that connects us today to life back 75 years ago. And it's also interesting too because it does say VP Day, Victory in the Pacific, which is how the day has always been described in Australia. So it does exactly what I wanted to say as an object. It looks great, has a great sense of an emotion and a connection, and it takes us today, people of today and visitors today and researchers of today in 2020, back to 1945 and just captures that moment of relief, celebration, euphoria, and a great sense of optimism as well.
Everybody's yelling and cheering and, hey, old chap, it's over.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. You can subscribe to the series by going to the Memorial's website or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.